They said you'd run. They said you'd break before the first bullet hit the dirt. They said you were cowards. From Tokyo, Japanese propagandists blasted messages through the jungle, into the airwaves, even scattered leaflets across American lines. Black troops are inferior, they declared. They won't stand and fight. They will flee. It was doctrine, not just rhetoric, ingrained in the minds of Japanese officers from the first days of the Pacific Campaign. And then they met the 93rd Infantry Division, an all-black combat unit.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Raised in a segregated America, armed with inferior weapons, often hand-me-downs, given orders from white officers who believed the same lies the enemy did. But that didn't matter, because you were there to fight. You marched through the sweltering jungles of Bougainville, through snake-infested rivers and mud that sucked your boots clean off. You battled not just an enemy entrenched in caves and foliage, but the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders. You weren't just fighting the Japanese. You were fighting a narrative. You were fighting every glance that doubted you, every white officer who saw you as expendable, every assumption that your skin color defined your courage. And still, you moved forward. When the 93rd landed on Morotai, the Japanese weren't expecting resistance from what they considered a second-rate unit. They saw black soldiers as weak links in the American chain. But it wasn't the Japanese who would be doing the surrounding. It was you. Jungle warfare is a kind of madness. It's not the heroics of charging fields or storming beaches. It's rot, disease, stench, and shadows. You patrol in silence, fingers on the trigger, sweat pouring down your back, every branch a possible ambush. You learn to move like the jungle itself, quiet, patient, brutal. And when you strike, you leave the enemy stunned. The Japanese learned that firsthand. They expected you to retreat. Instead, they watched as your squads executed precise flanking maneuvers, night raids, and coordinated ambushes with a discipline that contradicted every racist assumption they held. In Bougainville, the 93rd moved through dense vegetation that swallowed entire battalions. They didn't just survive, they hunted. You advanced over terrain that killed weaker men. You held lines longer than many thought possible. And you inflicted over 12,000 Japanese casualties. 12,000. Those weren't accidents. Those weren't lucky shots. Those were trained, hardened, battle-born men who were told by both friend and foe that they didn't belong in combat. And they proved them wrong, bullet by bullet, hill by hill. You weren't just soldiers, you were a contradiction. To your own government. To your own commanders. To the entire military-industrial complex of a segregated America. Because your success exposed a lie they desperately needed to keep alive. If black soldiers could fight with courage and skill equal to any white soldier, then what, exactly, justified keeping them in separate units? What excused giving them broken rifles and out-of-date radios? What reason was there to deny promotions, deny medals, deny recognition? The answer was none. But the machine kept spinning. Even as your brothers fell in the mud with malaria eating through their veins and shrapnel carving into their chests, the headlines back home stayed silent. Your victories were buried in footnotes. Your sacrifices filtered out of newsreels. They were afraid of what you represented. Not just valor, but equality. You see, the Japanese made a fatal mistake. They believed their own propaganda. They believed that black Americans wouldn't fight. And because of that, they underestimated you at every turn. They walked into ambushes thinking they were charging broken lines. They sent patrols into jungle trails where you waited, silent and steady. They left flanks exposed, thinking the 93rd couldn't mount a coordinated assault. They didn't plan for your discipline, your training, your rage. And they paid the price. With thousands of dead. With shattered companies. With failed objectives. The irony? You were still treated as expendable. The 93rd was given missions no one else wanted. Sent into areas too brutal, too remote, too unforgiving. If you failed, they'd say it was expected. If you succeeded, they'd say nothing. In the Philippines, the 93rd helped mop up thousands of die-hard Japanese stragglers who refused to surrender. These weren't disorganized survivors. They were battle-hardened, well-armed, and fanatical. But you closed in on them anyway. You swept through the Zambales Mountains. You sealed off escape routes, starved out resistance, forced surrenders at bayonet point. You held fire bases under constant mortar attacks, sometimes with no air support, no backup, no praise. And when it was over, and the dust cleared, and the corpses were counted, they still called you unfit. You didn't just fight a war. You fought perception. And that's a war that doesn't end when the gunfire stops. Because when the 93rd came home after 15 months in hell, there was no parade, no victory celebration, no front-page headlines. You returned to a country still segregated, still unwilling to see what you'd done, still whispering the same lies you'd disproven with blood. They said you were cowards. They said you'd flee. You left 12,000 enemy dead. That truth alone should have rewritten history books. But history has a habit of choosing who gets remembered. It wasn't until decades later, long after the rifles cooled and the bodies were buried, that the truth began to resurface. Not in textbooks, not in documentaries, but in the memories of the few who were still alive. In family stories, in faded journals, in battlefield reports that no one wanted to print at the time. And eventually, someone listened. In 2022, nearly 80 years too late, the 93rd Infantry Division received a Congressional Gold Medal. A medal that didn't erase the neglect, didn't undo the racism, but acknowledged what could no longer be denied. The men of the 93rd were warriors. They were brothers. They were Black. And they were American. Their story isn't just one of perseverance. It's a reminder that racism doesn't just divide, it weakens. It blinds. It leads enemies to underestimate their opponents. And it leads nations to squander their strongest assets. The Japanese made a fatal mistake, but so did the US military. While the enemy underestimated you, your own country marginalized you. It's a miracle you fought at all. But you did. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because there was a job to do. Because when the bullets flew, and the jungle screamed, and men cried out in fear, you stood your ground. Courage doesn't come in colors. Valor isn't limited by skin. The battlefield doesn't care who you are, it only knows what you're made of. And the men of the 93rd Infantry Division were made of steel, forged in fire, sharpened by rage, tempered by duty. They said you'd run. You didn't. You held. You fought. You won. And now, finally, history is catching up. Slowly, grudgingly, but it's catching up. Let it be known. The enemy underestimated you because of your race. America underestimated you because of its prejudice. But the battlefield never lies. It knows who stood, and who fell, and who never backed down. You carried a rifle, but you also carried something heavier. Heavier than ammo, heavier than gear. You carried the burden of being watched. Every move, every mistake, every hesitation, it wasn't just yours. It was your entire race on trial. One misstep, and they'd say, "See, told you so." One stumble, and it confirmed 1,000 whispered assumptions. You didn't get the luxury of being tired. You didn't get to be scared. You were expected to fail. And still, you stood taller than most. That's what no one saw. Not the white commanders handing out rations like favors. Not the reporters more interested in white heroism than Black survival. Not the officers who kept you off the front page and on the back lines. They didn't see the discipline. Didn't see the prayer circles before battle. Didn't see the way you cleaned your rifles with hands blistered from weeks in the jungle. Didn't see the way you shared what little you had, water, socks, cigarettes, because if you didn't look out for each other, no one else would. They didn't see the moments before contact. The quiet. That bone-deep quiet where every sound becomes sharper, every sense alert. The moment when you knew the enemy was close. Close enough to hear your breath. Close enough to smell your sweat. You didn't flinch. Didn't pray for backup that wouldn't come. Didn't wait for a white officer to tell you what courage meant. You showed them. In firefights that lasted all night. In ambushes that ended in hand-to-hand combat. In holding ground that was never supposed to be held. You weren't just reacting. You were adapting. By the second month in Bougainville, you understood the jungle better than your commanders. You knew the sound of a bird that didn't belong. You knew which part of the trail would be mined. You knew when to shoot, and when to wait. That wasn't taught. That was earned. You learned how to become ghosts in that jungle. Silent movements, dark faces blending with the night. You struck when the enemy least expected. You left them shattered, confused, panicked. And they began to realize this wasn't the enemy they thought they'd face. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't cowardice. This was vengeance with discipline. This was strategy with scars. 12,000 Japanese soldiers never left those islands. 12,000 never made it back to their empire. Some fell to bullets. Others to grenades. Some to booby traps rigged by hands calloused from years of being underestimated. And still, when the operations ended, there were commanders who said the 93rd needed improvement. Improvement. They meant obedience. They meant invisibility. They meant silence. But you weren't silent anymore. Not in the jungle. Not in the Philippines. And not in the barracks either. Because something changed in you. Maybe it was the blood. Maybe it was the bodies you stepped over. Or maybe it was that in the heat of war, when lives were on the line and the jungle tried to swallow you whole, you proved to yourself what you always knew. You didn't need their permission to be excellent. You watched white soldiers crack under pressure. You saw them disobey orders, freeze in battle, drop rifles and run. You saw fear in their eyes when the mortar came. But no one called them cowards. No one questioned their loyalty. No one said maybe they shouldn't be on the front lines. You were flawless. You had to be. And that perfection went uncelebrated. Medals that should have been yours went to others. Stories that should have started with your name were rewritten without you. And when the war ended, they told you to go home and be grateful. But grateful for what? For the scars? For the silence? For the country that trained you to kill but wouldn't let you sit at the same lunch counter? For fighting for a flag that didn't fight for you? The war ended, but the battle didn't. You came home to find that racism was still waiting. In the cities, in the towns, in the very army you served. And maybe that was the most bitter lesson of all. That even if you gave everything, even if you bled on foreign soil, even if you proved them wrong in every measurable way, they still saw your skin before your sacrifice. But history has a strange way of correcting itself. It took decades, far too long, but the story of the 93rd Infantry Division began to rise from the ashes. One testimony at a time, one uncovered report, one long-forgotten photograph. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself like a shattered monument finally being rebuilt. Not just a record of war, but a record of dignity, of endurance, of excellence denied but not diminished. Because the measure of a man isn't taken in medals or headlines. It's taken in the way he holds the line when no one else will. It's taken in the way he keeps moving forward, even when every voice tells him to fall back. That's the legacy you built. And when the Congressional Gold Medal was finally awarded some 77 years too late, it wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a reckoning. A long overdue acknowledgement that this country had wronged its bravest. That it had asked everything of you and given so little in return. But even still, you gave everything. You gave so much that even your enemies were forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. The Japanese, so sure of their racial theories, so confident in their superiority, walked straight into a storm of bullets they never saw coming. Because they never believed you could fight like that. Like warriors. Like brothers. Like soldiers with nothing left to prove. And everything to defend. And they paid the price for their ignorance. War is full of mistakes. But the most fatal mistake of all is arrogance. And racism is just arrogance in uniform. The 93rd didn't just beat the enemy. You outlasted a system that wanted you erased. You stood in the crucible and walked out forged. Not because America believed in you, but because you believed in each other. And in doing so, you rewrote a chapter of history that they tried to skip. Now, when people ask about the 93rd, they don't whisper. They don't mock. They don't lie. Now, they listen. They listen to the sound of boots in the mud. To the crack of rifles in the jungle. To the silence of a soldier who doesn't need to say he's brave because the record already proves it. They said you'd run, but you didn't. You marched. You fought. You stood. And now, the world stands with you. You didn't just march into battle, you marched through a wall of silence. And not the kind you find on the battlefield. This was a deeper silence. A deliberate one. The kind that settles over a nation when it doesn't want to confront what it's done, or who it's ignored. You knew the war wouldn't end when the rifles stopped firing. You knew it wouldn't end with a surrender ceremony aboard a battleship. Because for you and every man who wore the 93rd patch on his shoulder, the real war started the moment you stepped back onto American soil. The signs hadn't changed. The rules hadn't changed. The stares, the slurs, the segregation, they were waiting for you, like they never left. One day, you're holding a machine gun defending a hill. The next, you're told to use the back door. They still called you boy. Even after you led men in combat. Even after you cleared out Japanese strongholds. Even after you returned with ribbons on your chest and steel in your spine. You weren't just fighting for your life out there. You were fighting for the right to be seen, to be counted, to be honored, not as a symbol, not as a quota, but as a soldier. You earned it 100 times over. But history had a convenient excuse. They served. Let's move on. No parade. No monuments. No moment of national reflection. The nation that sent you to die had no time to remember you once you survived. And yet, somehow, you didn't grow bitter. You didn't let that silence rot you from the inside. Because you knew what you did. You remembered the faces of the men who didn't make it. Men who would never walk home, never hold their kids again, never see a country that might one day say, we were wrong. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes, Sometimes it's rewritten by those it tried to forget. The story of the 93rd didn't disappear because it was small. It disappeared because it was dangerous. Dangerous to the lies they'd built. Dangerous to the myth of white military superiority. Dangerous to the idea that black soldiers couldn't be trusted with frontline duties, with leadership, with glory. Because if the 93rd could accomplish what it did, if it could walk through hell and come out decorated, undefeated, unbroken, then what excuse did anyone have? What excuse did the army have for keeping units segregated? What excuse did Congress have for ignoring black veterans? What excuse did America have for building a world where valor came in one color? The truth was, there was no excuse. You exposed the flaw in the foundation. You didn't need speeches. You didn't need slogans. You had performance. You had actions that couldn't be denied. Jungle patrols where you lost half your unit and still finished the mission. Fire-based defenses that held under 3 days of continuous artillery. Recon missions so deep behind enemy lines, command assumed you'd been killed until you walked back out, dragging prisoners with you. And those commanders, the ones who doubted you, they signed off on every casualty report. They saw the kill counts. They read the citations. And still, they wrote you out. Because to write you in would mean telling the truth. And truth can be dangerous when it's been buried that long. In shadows, in dusty boxes tucked away in basements of military archives. And when the story of the 93rd Infantry Division finally roared back to life, it didn't whisper. It shouted. It shouted about bravery under fire. It shouted about men who fought harder with less. It shouted about how wrong America had been to doubt you. You didn't need anyone to give you your legacy. You carved it out yourself with bayonets and bullets and blood. You earned your place in history not because someone allowed it but because you made it undeniable. You shattered their expectations and their ranks. And while they bled, stunned by your ferocity, your own country pretended it was business as usual. But the record doesn't lie. 12,000 enemy dead. From a division they once said wouldn't hold a line. From men they said wouldn't fire. From soldiers they never planned to salute. Now look, your names are on the walls. Your medals are enshrined. Your stories are told finally, with the weight and the reverence they always deserved.